these new atheists, they often position Muslims as incompatible with the West due to their faith. And as I've already indicated, arguments are used to justify military action post 9/11. So I've already dealt with point two. I think on point one, the incompatibility point is important to bear in mind. We, I don't know how many of the audience, but Al-Balagh obviously is UK-based, but we have living in Brexit Britain or a Europe which is lurching quite sharply to the right, whether it's in the UK where immigration is such a concern, to the Netherlands where they've just elected a far-right, political leader who literally wants to ban the Quran, to Italy where again, it's an anti-immigration, anti-Muslim kind of candidate, to France where Marine Le Pen is currently probably the most popular politician, and she is again virulently anti-Muslim. So all of these countries, basically do hold this position that Islam and the West is incompatible. And one of the things that we need to bear in mind is that we do need to have arguments to counteract that sort of thinking, and develop ways of presenting those arguments and having a certain positive influence on the society to make these societies less hostile to Muslims. And so, on the other hand, the Muslim population in these countries is growing, and in the last census, in England and Wales, at least, Muslims made up about 6.5% of the population in the UK, in England and Wales, and they make up probably around those sorts of percentages in many European countries. And so, and they're going to increase, I think over the next 20 years or so, it's expected that Muslims will become close to 15% in some countries by the middle of this century. So that's a significant presence, but that presence could continue to be an underclass that is not properly represented in the political context, is not is economically disempowered and so on. So those are all concerns that we need to think about when it comes to the potential insidious effects of this kind of argumentation being promoted by the new atheists. Okay, in that connection, I did want to mention some other literature, and again, unfortunately, I'm having to mention some of the new atheist literature, but I don't have that many books that I can mention, which I can't think almost of any books I can mention which present the counter narrative or the critique. Because Muslims, when we end up writing, we're writing about other issues which are perhaps more pressing for us. It's not to say that these are not pressing issues, it's just we have invested so little of our resources in developing expertise in these areas that we don't really, unfortunately, we haven't got the sort of resources that would allow us to write critiques of all of these books. So, one of the most important writers in Britain today is someone called Douglas Murray. His books are routinely bestsellers, and if there's a single religion that he hates with a passion, it's Islam. Again, a very eloquent writer, very sort of like malicious sort of like discourse. He has a recent book called The Strange Death of Europe, which is criticized in some sections of the press, particularly on the left and in the intellectual classes, but it really plays to the prejudices of the average British reader or the average Western reader. A slightly more highbrow version of this is written by and this is a genre of writing which has been very popular over the last 20 years or so, but written by a columnist an American columnist in the Financial Times. His name is Christopher Caldwell, and he wrote a book called Reflections on the Revolution in Europe. This is about 15 years old at this point in time, and he talks about how Muslim immigration is ultimately the major threat to the West. Now, I mean, Douglas Murray is Christopher Caldwell is a bit different. He's more of a conservative writer. He's probably a believer in God. Douglas Murray is an atheist. It's really fascinating to see people like Douglas Murray. He shares platforms with people like Sam Harris, so he's kind of like part of the new generation because he's a bit younger than all of these other characters who we've already mentioned. But it's fascinating to see him as an atheist in sort of recent times talking about the need to revive Christian culture, right? He's atheist, he's a gay man, and but because he's concerned about the weakness of European culture in the face of Islam, he wants to revive Christian culture, even though he doesn't believe in Christianity or doesn't even believe in God. And so these are the sort of internal paradoxes and sort of like contradictions of these sorts of movements, and it just needs to be something that we bear in mind. I've realized I've just gone on for quite a while, I think, and maybe I should let me. If people have questions, please do ask. But I'm going to try to wrap up soon. I still have quite a few slides actually, or maybe 2 or 3 slides. But let me maybe give some Islamic perspective on some of these questions. Alhamdulillah, we are increasingly getting some very talented scholars, writing in English. But scholarly work is sort of different to this kind of popular and populist writing of the New Atheists and people like Douglas Murray. These are written by they're best-selling books, which are written in a style that sort of like is simple, easy to read, uncomplicated, doesn't have footnotes and scholarly sort of like discussion and things like this. And it's very cheap, so you can buy a book by Douglas Murray probably for £10. Whereas the book I've got on the screen right now costs about €200, I think. Ibn Taymiyyah on Reason and Revelation. Actually, no, this book you can also download, I think, for free because the publishers or the author has managed to get some kind of subsidy which allows for the PDF to be available freely. But this is a study of Ibn Taymiyyah's engagement with the question of reason and revelation. A brilliant sort of intellectual tour de force. It's his greatest work. It's about 10 volumes in its published edition today. The original Arabic work on which it was based. And Ustadh 𝐏𝐀𝐏 𝐷𝐞𝐿, he basically he studied, like he read 4,000 pages of the Dar'u Ta'arud, or as it's called, Dar'u Ta'arud al-Aqli wal-Naql. He studied 4,000 pages of that. That's the length of the book. And he basically has given us a fantastic service in presenting Ibn Taymiyyah's sort of conception and theory of reason. And the title of the book is really fascinating. It says Dar'u Ta'arud al-Aqli wal-Naql. Aql is reason. Naql is transmitted. Basically, Naql is revelation. So it's Naqala means to transmit. So this is something that is ultimately transmitted from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala via Jibreel from the Prophet ﷺ. And Naql is used to describe the sort of what we receive from the Prophet ﷺ. So reason versus revelation. And Dar'u Ta'arud means sort of rejecting the conflict, or obviating conflict between reason and revelation. And Ibn Taymiyyah has a principle where he says ultimately, reason and revelation will never conflict. What happens is either what is thought to be revelation is not soundly transmitted, or it's been misinterpreted, or what is thought to be reason is misconceived and is not truly sound reason. So there's always a reconciliation in Islam, in the view of Ibn Taymiyyah, and this is the view of many scholars. Though Ibn Taymiyyah is actually making this argument within an intra-Muslim context, but he basically says there is never conflict between reason and revelation. A sort of very strong tendency. He's arguing against the Ash'ari, I think, and the Ash'aris, particularly Fakhr al-Razi, who articulates, the Ash'ari position in its mature form before Ibn Taymiyyah, argues that actually reason and revelation can conflict. And in that context, fascinatingly, for maybe a lot of modern Muslims, Fakhr al-Razi says, in the context of the conflict of reason and revelation, we give priority to reason, right? What you could say, when science and religion conflict, we give priority to science. Now, I mean, that's actually too reductive, and Fakhr al-Razi is a very sophisticated thinker, and he would have had very sort of more substantial arguments to buttress his position. But certainly, I mean, you can understand that can create a certain degree of disagreement. And as I say, as Ibn Taymiyyah argues, these two things are not truly in conflict. And I think, even Fakhr al-Razi, he basically will say that, look, something's being misunderstood if it appears that these two things are in conflict. And he has, the reason ultimately he says that you would prioritize reason over, revelation in context of apparent conflict is because he argues that ultimately we use reason to justify our acceptance of revelation. But I'm going to set that aside for now. And then, does embracing modernity mean, it should say mean here. Let me just correct that very quickly, if I can. Sorry. Does embracing modernity mean abandoning historic beliefs? And, I would argue that certainly doesn't need to be the case, and we can discuss specific sort of propositions, specific questions. I also want to refer to three sort of, or maybe just the first two are quite relevant. I've already referred to colonialism and various other challenges that exist that have created a context in which Muslims seem backward, so to speak. But the first thing that I want to mention here is so-called conflict thesis. And there's this belief that had emerged in Western historiography over the course of the 19th and early 20th centuries that said that science and religion are in conflict with each other. And this was, developed by certain historians of science in the late 19th, early 20th century. And it became kind of, the common understanding. People generally think in the West, science and religion have been in conflict in the West for centuries, right? And ultimately, science defeated religion. The history and historians now have, they largely reject the conflict thesis. They recognize that actually things are quite complicated. And there were instances where, those two things were maybe in a certain amount of tension, and other instances where things were completely harmonious. And so, in fact, the conflict thesis is something that is an ideological argument about the nature of science and religion. And so, certainly within the Muslim context, religion and science do not have the same kind of historical tension that, Europe has kind of, in this problematic historiography, argued has existed in the European context. And I think one of the best scholars to write about science in the Muslim context is Justin Stearns, who has a book called Revealed Sciences, because in the Islamic tradition, ilm or ulum covers all disciplines, including the ulum shar'iyya, the sharia sciences, as it were. And this distinction between science and knowledge that has emerged in European languages is really a product of a particular ideological interpretation of history. The second book I'm going to mention is The Myth of Religious Violence. I really highly recommend this to anyone who is interested in the question of sort of singling out religion as a having violent tendencies. And this is, I think, very capably and consummately deconstructed in this work. And so I just wanted to highlight this work. And then the third, this is probably, in my estimation, it's one of the best. I mean, intellectually, it's quite demanding, but it's philosophically one of the best critiques of the New Atheist movement. It's called Where the Conflict Really Lies, Science, Religion, and Naturalism. And so Alvin Plantinga is very self-consciously trying to critique the so-called four horsemen of New Atheism. The four new atheists I started this discussion with, and he basically presents, a fairly compelling argument that actually when it comes to the question of science versus religion, if you believe so naturalism is the belief that there is no God, that everything that exists kind of like by chance, and there is no external agent in that process. And Plantinga's argument, he's a very capable philosopher, a very influential philosopher actually, and he basically says that if you presuppose atheism, it's a lot more difficult to make the argument that science and rational sort of reasoning can be used to interpret the world. This is kind of a somewhat reductive argument, but I'm reducing the sort of complexity of his argument. But he basically says, if you don't believe in God, it's very difficult to be able to trust science. But if you believe in God, then the world being interpretable makes sense. And so he ultimately argues, if you want to be a true scientist, believing in God is the most sort of like philosophically rational basis on which to be a scientist in the first place. And naturalism is extremely difficult to sort of use as a basis for sort of upholding the legibility and the sort of science, the meaningfulness of science. Okay, so I guess I had a couple of questions of my own, but I wanted to open up the floor for discussion. We have about 25 minutes for discussion, inshallah. So please feel free to put in any questions that you have, and I look forward to hearing from you, inshallah. Love you. I hope people do have some questions, inshallah. And you can, switch on your mics and cameras if you like. I should say that, it's important in something like, the study of atheism in particular to be sort of someone who's asking and interrogating, because otherwise we potentially sort of like we in some respects we don't want to reinforce their or justify their arguments about Muslims not being able to engage in these sorts of rational arguments. But so someone's asking a question. I find extensive difficulty when engaging with traditional Islamic work due to these counterpoints. Do you have any advice for maintaining patience while learning these highly difficult points? So do you want to mention some of those points? And if you like, sister, you can sort of switch the microphone on so that I can hear you. But I think perhaps actually I should have kept the discussion, my presentation shorter and had a longer period for discussion. But please ask specific questions. At the end of the day, the way in which someone becomes good at anything is by engaging in practice. And if you're studying in the humanities, which is something which we've lost as a community, we don't sort of like study these things and we don't cultivate these sorts of values, which is part of our post-colonial sort of like weakness. When you don't cultivate those skills, then these seem very difficult and challenging. So but actually I'll just say, like, as a Muslim academic, part of the reason I've not actually written about these sorts of things is because it's so easy and straightforward. I mean, I don't find it threatening in any way whatsoever. And so, there are, in so many respects, many of us who are working in academia find other issues to be so more pressing and so more urgent. We don't find ourselves in any way whatsoever threatened or made sort of like to feel that our faith is in any way sort of in question because of the arguments that these people make. I used to feel that way to a certain extent in my late teens, and but by my early 20s, I was already getting access to the sorts of critiques of these sorts of perspectives. And so, but someone needs to write more people need to write popular literature that will help, countering these sorts of perspectives. If you like, I can talk briefly about the problem of evil, for example, from an Islamic perspective. But I would like some people to sort of like engage with what I'm saying. Please say yes or no at least. If you'd like me to engage with some of those sorts of questions. Okay, so great. So now we're getting a few questions. So a lot of it is around Islamic legal punishments. So, I mean, on the Islamic legal punishments, the best paper, in my view, is Jonathan Brown's Stoning and Hand Cutting. It's published by the Yaqeen Institute, and the Yaqeen Institute has some of the best work on these sorts of issues anyway. So let me deal with Islamic legal punishments, and then we'll talk about briefly the idea of the problem of evil, and then I'll answer Brother Norman's question as well, which is how can we overcome Western subversion, at least at an individual level, being a Muslim, which are all extremely important questions. So when it comes to Islamic legal punishments, there is a lot of literature on this already, but there's an important book by a colleague of mine at Harvard. Her name is Intisar Rabb. She's written a book called Doubt's Benefit, I believe, published by Cambridge University Press, where she basically argues that when it comes to the question of the hudud, the principle is doubt's benefit. Doubt's benefit. It's an academic book. I mean, these far better for sort of like a popular readership is Jonathan Brown's article on the hudud. So you can Google Jonathan Brown hudud laws, and essentially when it comes to Islamic punishments, there are 5, according to some 6 hudud punishments, which seem very severe and gruesome and so on, but they are ultimately sort of making a moral point. They're basically saying that these are things that people shouldn't do. There's also, because of as discussed, Intisar Rabb's book Doubt's Benefit, she studies a legal maxim or a legal principle, which is idra al-hudud bi-shubuhat, that avoid the hudud with doubt. That's why she's called it Doubt's Benefit. That if there's any way in which the hudud can be obviated, and Jonathan Brown in his article presents kind of a long list of maybe 60 things which a judge needs to take into consideration before applying the hudud, then you don't apply the hudud. So the vast majority of people, caught for theft or, adultery and those sorts of things in Islamic history, the hudud wasn't applied. In fact, my own teacher, Muhammad Akram al-Nadwi, says that no one in Islamic history was ever punished for being caught, committing zina, right? And, that makes a lot of sense, because the Quran literally requires 4 male witnesses to witness the actual act of sexual intercourse for that to be something which is, a punish that can be applied. And for it to be stoning, it has to be something which is being engaged in by someone who is previously married. And so I think Khalid Abul Fadl has a nice short op-ed piece in the LA Times from around the year 2000 called Islamic Sex Laws, where he basically says, look, this is basically a clear example of a legal system moralizing. It's making a moral point. It's saying this is so bad that people should deserve to be stoned to death. But in practice, it's impossible to apply. All the people who were punished, and I think a total of 5 or 6 people were punished in the time of the Prophet and the Khulafa al-Rashidin for these for zina, were people who came and insisted on being punished, having confessed freely, right? And the Sharia permits the retraction of one's confession, and there's no right to sort of induce a confession, for example. And so in those sorts of contexts, you need to ask, well, why do people want to do this? So the context, I forget the name of, I think it was Ma'iz, who was punished in the time of the Prophet ﷺ, who came and, he came to the Prophet ﷺ and he said, I have engaged in illicit sexual intercourse punish me. And the Prophet ﷺ ignored him for the first time. He turned away from him, and the person came round and he affirmed on himself 4 times. Some of the ulama argue that this is like 4 witnesses. And then the Prophet asked people around him, is this person sound of mind? Does he know what's implied by his, confession? And they said, yes, he's sound of mind, etc. And then he asked that a group of the Sahaba go and punish him. And, after he was taken and he was punished, one of the Sahaba said to the Prophet ﷺ something along the lines of, he was just talking on the side and saying that, what a foolish person, he should have taken Allah's forgiveness or something like this, or, he shouldn't have come and done that. And the Prophet ﷺ said to him that, don't say this about your brother, because right now he is swimming in the rivers of paradise. So the expiation or the forgiveness of sins that arises from going through that punishment is the reason why this person came to the Prophet and confessed, even though the Prophet's own explicit guidance on these questions is you don't make this public. As another hadith says, "Man ata shay'an min hadhihi al-qadhurat falyastathir bi satrillah wa liyastaghfirillah." Whoever commits any of these filthy things, let them conceal themselves with Allah's concealment and let them ask Allah's forgiveness. Right? So the Islamic principle is you do not publicly announce these sorts of things because it's more damaging in society for these sorts of things to be publicly announced. But then if this sort of thing is perpetrated and there are 4 witnesses who witness, and as I say, the ulama say that no one's ever been caught in Islamic history committing zina and punished because they were caught. And any cases that you've heard in the modern period is probably because of a breakdown of the Sharia and its proper procedures not being observed. But so again, read Jonathan Brown's article in that regard. And I think overall, these sorts of things are, also related to people's sensibilities. People often forget that, the sorts of states where they've eliminated corporal punishment of any kind are the same states that are sending, Israel billions of dollars to, and mostly in the form of military aid, to create sort of horrors and executions on an industrial scale. And people should recognize that, look, there's so much hypocrisy in the world when these people start to make me feel bad because theoretically in the Islamic tradition it's possible to have someone have their hand cut or be stoned to death. Those are theoretical positions which are rarely, if ever, applied. And we're witnessing on a daily basis the mass slaughter of people, like quite literally witnessing it in video form now. And these people are saying there's no limit to how many how much Israel can go, right? There's no limit. Literally, that's what the sort of language that they're using. So I think just I hope that gives a bit of an answer to your question. I hope it helps a little, inshallah. The other question was, Allahumma salli ala Sayyidina Muhammad. Let me just very briefly touch on the problem of evil. So the Islamic response, in my estimation, a very compelling Islamic response to the problem of evil is the fact that ultimately, the dunya is finite and the akhirah is infinite. And so when it comes to suffering in this world, it's quite easy for us to say that, as the Prophet ﷺ says, يؤتى يوم القيامة بأشقى رجل في العالم فيدخل في الجنة ساعة فيسأل هل علمت من الشر شيئا أو كما قال صلى الله عليه وسلم. The most wretched person on the planet, on the earth, will be brought on Yawm al-Qiyamah and entered into paradise for a moment, and then taken out and asked, have you ever suffered anything? And they will say no. So the suffering of this world, as traumatic and as painful it is, even to watch on our television screens, nasallallahu salam al-afiyah, is, really ephemeral. And just as the pleasures of this world are ephemeral, the same hadith is a warning to us, because it says the most sort of like happy person in the world is brought and he's put in the hellfire for a moment. And he's asked, have you known any happiness? And he says no. There is an interesting debate about what some of the theologians describe as fana'un nar, a debate about whether the punishment of the hellfire is eternal. And most of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah say yes, it is eternal because of the language used in the Quran. But actually, Ibn Taymiyyah is one of the scholars who is fascinatingly someone who argues that it may well not be eternal punishment, and part of the reason for that is finite sin does not is not sort of commensurate with infinite punishment. So even there, like, there is a way of managing the problem of evil, when it comes to the apparent infinite punishment of people who are sinful. Okay, so how can we overcome Western subversion, at least at the individual level, being a Muslim? And I think this is, to be honest, we should be thinking far beyond the individual level, because we will all have, inshallah, families, children who it's our responsibility, as the Prophet ﷺ said, to raise on Islam. And we need to equip them with the resources that would allow them to defend their own, faith, and have a sense, not just defending one's faith and being in a defensive position, but having a sense of pride and being able to promote that faith. That's so important. And, this requires investment as a community. We need to have a recognition. And I would say, among our own children, just to give a personal anecdote for a moment, I studied at high school level to eventually the sciences, so that I could study medicine at university. I got into medical school, but then I decided to pull out in the last minute before I actually started the course and switched to Islamic studies. At university, in a Western university, it was taught mainly by non-Muslims actually, but I also had the opportunity to study with ulama. I knew ulama, and so that was 20 years ago, just over 20 years ago, that I made that decision. And that's why I can, engage these sorts of issues. And I hope to, I'm, 39 years old right now, 40 in the Hijri calendar, and I hope to do this until I die. If Allah gives me life, that may be another 40, 50 years, inshallah. And so that's the kind of investment that we need to make as a community, that we put in the years, whether it's individually, or whether it's us encouraging our children to go into these things, or whether it's us supporting others financially to do this sort of, making these sorts of decisions, or creating the institutional infrastructure that will facilitate that. There needs to be money provided to scholarships for people to go and pursue these kinds of studies. So I would just highlight that that's how we ultimately overcome this kind of Western subversion. Because without creating the scholars who can counteract this sort of insidious messaging on the part of the West, we're always going to be vulnerable. Can I repeat the name of the book? I don't know which book you're referring to. You have to remind me. Oh, sorry, that was Doubt's Benefit. That's fine. So under Islamic law in an Islamic state, the death penalty for apostasy has strict conditions, just like other punishments. The death penalty for apostasy is somewhat controversial in the first place, because not everyone considered it to be something which is punishable by death, even though this is the main position of the four madhabs. But I think there's very good and solid arguments. Again, Jonathan Brown has an excellent article on this. There are very sound arguments by contemporary ulama of very high standing that there are question marks around the death penalty for apostasy, but that's a slightly different discussion, inshallah. What's really ironic, of course, is people preoccupied with these sorts of questions, and literally these civilizations are killing, like slaughtering dozens, if not hundreds, on a routine basis. Like right now, basically the war in Gaza is a war by sort of Western superpowers against Gaza. It's funded by the United States. And so in that sort of context, I find it somewhat out of place for us to be sort of preoccupied with some of these questions. It's like, these people don't care about like the sanctity of human life. Why are they? And it just reveals that these arguments are ultimately a manifestation of imperial hubris. They want to, just because they can, they want to make these arguments that make us feel like, we're deficient. We are not deficient. We are, we have the izzah of Islam. And so for that reason, there are two levels of this. One is the intellectual response, but the other is just to recognize, look, we've got nothing to prove. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has done that. And so, we do need to develop that sense of internal confidence in our own deen, inshallah. Okay. That witnessed the statement of kufr. So yeah, I mean, I think, as I say, the question of apostasy is quite complex. How would you respond to the atheist asking about the way the Taliban treat women in Afghanistan? I mean, whoever said the Taliban represented Islam, right? I mean, why am I, to use a Christian phrase, am I my brother's keeper? The thing is, why are they asking you about, like, are you a member of the Taliban, right? I mean, like, the Taliban are, very flawed students. Actually, it's in their name. Taliban and Dari means students. They probably have good intentions. They want to, and may Allah reward them for their intentions and guide them, inshallah, to the right path. But their attitudes towards women have been criticized by ulama for decades. So the restriction of women's education, those sorts of things are problematic in many ways. But why should, if someone asks me, will you condemn the Taliban? It's like, what on earth? Like, what have I got to do with the Taliban? So I hope that answers the question a little. At the end of the day, like my teacher, Sheikh Muhammad Akram al-Nadwi, is the author of a 40-volume encyclopedia called Al-Wafa bi Asma' nisa, which means like the fulfillment of one's pledge, in a sense, in giving the names of the women. It contains about 8,000 female hadith scholars in that book. And so, that illustrates that, Islamic scholarship has always greatly valued the work that women have done. I've got a couple more questions. I'll keep going. I hope I can just wrap up these questions, inshallah. How would you respond to the question of rape, Islamic law on rape? I hope you can think of it from various perspectives, like considering modern methods of proving a crime. How will they manage for victims? I mean, the thing is, those sorts of questions, there is a great deal of latitude when it comes to, accepting different standards of evidence and so on. And so I think sometimes what happens is one relatively narrow interpretation becomes maybe legislated as law in a place like Pakistan. And then sometimes it's the state's kind of structure and legal system that limits the way of, utilizing other methods. I'm not an expert on that sort of question. I know Hina Azam has probably the most important book on this, Sexual Violation in Islamic Law. She's a Muslim scholar, and even if she's someone who, she doesn't wear the hijab, but she's an Islamic legal scholar based in the United States. And I would, recommend reading her book. I've heard very good things about it. So there are, the Islamic legal tradition has plenty of ways of creating restitution for these sorts of problems. Explaining freedom of expression in Islam to an atheist is something I find extraordinarily difficult to do. Are there any good resources for this? Not that I know of. And, if you like, Sister Sarah, you can send me an email about this later on. But freedom of expression is one of these very ironic, doctrines from, the Western tradition. Freedom of expression, as far as I'm concerned, is a tenet of Western, faith. It's very difficult to uphold in various contexts, but it's not a tenet of Islamic faith. And so they created various aqaid or tenets of faith. We don't have an obligation to adhere to them just because, قُلْ لَا يَسْتَوِي الْخَبِيثُ وَلَا الطَّيِّبُ وَلَوْ أَعْجَبَكَ كَثْرَةُ الْخَبِيثِ. The impure and the pure are not equal, even as the Quran says, even if the abundance of impurity around you just is somewhat overwhelming. And this is something that we need to constantly remind ourselves. So freedom of expression has existed in a legitimate form in Islamic history. throughout Islamic history, people have written, all sorts of arguments and all sorts of positions. There's an extraordinary latitude in terms of what people could say and do. And so that's never been in question. What happens with these freedom of expression fundamentalists that you have in the West is they create this kind of certain conception of freedom of expression, which comes out, again, of a very distinct history of tension with the church, which didn't exist in the Islamic tradition because there wasn't a church entity that was imposing its theological perspective. In fact, there was an attempt to do this by the Khalifat al-Ma'mun, who dies in around 218 of the Hijri calendar, 833. And it fails miserably. He couldn't impose his theological beliefs about the Quran on the Ummah. It was rejected. And so that sort of, belief, that sort of imposition of belief doesn't exist in the Islamic tradition, whereas it existed in the West, and that's why they needed freedom of expression to be able to criticize the church and all of these sorts of things. And then suddenly, from that strange context, you're trying to impose it. Freedom of expression was originally developed to, give the weak a voice against the powerful. Now it's being used to suppress Muslims, who are some of the weakest people in these societies. So it's a complete inversion of their own values. But it's just another way in which racism and imperialism is perpetuated in these sorts of cultures, including internal to these cultures. And so we need to, you can have a look at, I'm not very familiar with Muhammad Hijab's treatment of these questions, but some of that is, I'm sure, valuable as well. Thank you for a great presentation. Okay, Barakallah fikum, Jazakumullah khairan, and you can just Google my name, Usaama Al-Azami, Oxford, and you'll find my email address on my Oxford page, inshallah. Jazakumullah khairan. I've gone over time a bit, but I hope that was somewhat useful, inshallah. Fi amanillah. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته